I've been working in technology for about 20 years, bouncing back and forth between engineering and product management. Basically, I was always the most technical guy in the business meeting or the most businessy guy in the technical meeting. But about 10 years ago, after my team spent about 2 weeks fixing all of the problems that I introduced while doing a lot of last-minute coding ahead of a product launch, I dedicated my career to stop being a shoddy developer and instead decided to focus on helping engineers, designers, and product managers bring their visions to life. Like everyone else, I've pushed Agile development processes at virtually every place that I work. I've worked at companies very large, like Microsoft large, and very small, like startup with 4 people small. And these are some of the insights that I've gained, and I hope that they are helpful to you. So the concept of agility and then Agile with like a capital A are such a frequently discussed topic. And at this point, elements of agility are present in almost all types of software development. But when a company or a product team proudly announces, oh yes, we are Agile, it can seem that the common element between all of them is that they just simply don't practice the, quote, classic waterfall development process. And that is to say, they don't make an exhaustive specification, they don't get it approved by all the stakeholders, they don't have a fixed budget, an ironclad ship date, then enter this project, go through the exact formal, predictable phases of design, development, and test, then ship it, all without ever making any changes to the original plan, regardless of whatever new details come in. But the truth is, that is not actually how waterfall planning ever really worked. When I was working at Microsoft in the 90s, that was really the only applied model for software development. And while it's definitely true that the elements usually described in the literature about how waterfall worked, it's really presented as like a way of doing business, and it's just a rhetorical straw man, like a false counterexample to show why it's so important to stay agile. Because no one would suggest that being like inflexible, destined to fail, like those are the good approaches. So what exactly, when we say we're being agile, what are we trying to actually be agile about? What level of flexibility are we hoping to achieve by adopting this model? And what does that actually mean? So today I want to talk about a set of questions. These questions are just designed to be thought exercises, and they are based on my own experiences, lots of successes, even more failures. And whether you are the CEO of a company, the head of engineering or product development, a scrum manager, a development lead, or one of the people who actually does all the work, I hope that they provide some insight and value to you that you can take home and apply to your own career. So in English, when we're in school, there's this turn of phrase that we always learn about how you investigate a crime or you do a research paper, and it's called the 5 W's and the H. Who, what, where, when, why, and how. Now, this as a rhetorical device is very good for its original purposes. The very order of this list kind of affects our thoughts and can get in the way of prioritizing the questions that you need to ask yourself frequently, before, during, and after a software project. So the order of the questions that I'd like you to think about is why? Like, why are we doing this? What are we actually trying to do? Who would participate? How are we going to actually do it? When will we do it? Where? I suppose is also a good question to ask in some cases, but if you're asking like, where's my team, or where are we, maybe you have other problems that you need to address first. But for leaders of projects, a lot of time can be spent talking about what's going to happen, or when, or how much it's going to cost, but the commonly overlooked question is why? Why are we doing this? So for projects large and small, that question is extremely important. Whether it's a new feature, a point release, a brand new product line, understanding the why can be the most important question to ask, especially in an environment that is attempting to truly be agile. So some bad answers that you might get if you ask why: oh, well, because the marketing team wants it, or oh, because it's really important to the sales team, or because it'll drive shareholder value, or oh, because it's this really new technology, it's really cool. Now, those might sound like kind of throwaway answers, but I've actually heard those come to me when I ask the question myself. And so it's really important to get down into the weeds a little bit at the appropriate level for your own audience and for your own project to answer this particular question. So is it to do whatever your widget does, but better somehow? What is better? How do you measure that? Is it some mechanical goal like, reducing crash rates or increasing signups or reducing the bounce rates or shortening load times? Is it to satisfy like the perceived whims of your management team or your shareholders or something? More often than not, the answer to that question, why, is either poorly formed in the first place, poorly communicated, or frequently both. So if you find yourself at the head of a division or just working on a project, you should be able to understand why this particular project is entering your life. From there, you should be able to associate this project with a set of performance objectives and all those fun management terms, or maybe a series of strategic initiatives that your company is working on. But you really have to sit down and ask the question, why? Because you'd be surprised how often you'll get really crappy answers. And it's not because people are trying to be funny, it's just they don't actually know why. They're doing it, well, because I was told to. For example, if the purpose of your project is, to reduce load times, you would be I don't know, maybe you wouldn't be surprised, but I never cease to be surprised at how often no one has actually asked the users if this load time is an actual problem. No one has actually set up a way to measure it in real time to find out if they're getting any better. No one has asked the architect or the testers if this particular approach would address the root of the problem. They just sort of declare that, reducing load times is a big project for milestone X, and off we go. And no one says, well, why? So a long time ago, I worked at a large comparison shopping site. I went through a lot of versions, starting from a site in 1997 that had a whopping 30,000 items on it. And then it grew to have like 1 million items by 1999, and it grew and grew until it began to sort of exceed the limits of SQL technology at the time, at least what it was capable of back then. And so our engineers, very clever, we thought up new ways to build indexes, ways to get things faster and faster. We kind of pushed that up to 2.5, maybe 3 million. But this was at MSN, and there were millions of concurrent users every day. So really, to get anything to go any faster would require technology that we didn't really have at the time. And so this was all happening, behind the scenes while our business partners were busily dreaming up this idea that we would have the world's largest comparison shopping site. And so it wasn't just the thousands of merchants that were actually working directly with us and submitting their data feeds. The idea was, well, we would integrate Amazon, and we would integrate eBay, and we would go with PriceGrabber and CNET and all these other comparison shopping sites. So the number of potentially searchable items that were going to go into our catalog ballooned all the way to 30 million. And so I was very early in my career at this time, so I didn't really have visibility into the, every little part of the problem. But the business development process worked, and we signed these deals with the major companies. The categorization engines started to figure out how to get all the socks together and the shoes together. The matching engines found the different digital cameras that were the same model and put them together so you could compare prices. And it was inching along. This was probably an 18-month-long project. But there was this one piece of problem that kept getting bigger and bigger and taking more and more engineers and more time and ballooning cost. And it was to disambiguate search terms so that you would know what catalog to put the search results into. So as I said before, 2.5 million was kind of the upper limit. And so the idea was if someone searched, we would say, oh, they're searching for a book, send them off to the book catalog. There were about that many books. It worked out just fine. Well, the problem was this disambiguation engine, it didn't work really at all. I mean, if you search for China, did you mean the country? Did you mean like a book about it, a movie about it, a poster about a book that had the movie in it, the wrestler, maybe some actual China that you were going to serve food on? For pretty much every search term, there were a variety of pretty reasonable alternative meanings that it would be possible for the learner or for the searcher to want. And so we did this over and over again. The team got bigger, and we had like this was like 2002, so we had the very early versions of machine learning, trying to get it better and better at guessing. But the problem was there was no way to guess perfectly because you just didn't know what it was because there were obviously many potential answers. So that missing question was, why? Why are we doing this? Because the what was clear. There were too many items in the catalog, and we had to figure out how to do it. But we had to have that opportunity to back up and say, why are we doing this? And it turned out, not surprisingly, the approach was very obvious. We would simply show a couple of results from each of the catalogs, and you, as a searcher, you'd be like, oh, I was actually looking for China in home and garden, and you'd click, and off you'd go, and you'd do your thing. And now this approach seems obvious in retrospect. I mean, Amazon works like this today still. But in 2003, it wasn't until we sat down, asked that question, why, that our engineering, design, and program management teams were able to actually find like a sensible and scalable solution. So my next question is, you've got this vision. You hear it. Can it be over-communicated? I mean, many leaders at every level, they can kind of get bored when they talk about a vision or an end state. I mean, it's understandable. It's easy to get bored. You talk about the same thing over and over again. But it's very important to remember that most people, they're not listening. They're not listening to you. I'm not saying that you're boring. I'm not saying your presentation isn't awesome. I'm not saying that you didn't do a good job of like connecting with your audience. They're probably paying attention, maybe. They're probably at the meeting, hopefully. But even if they're there, sitting up, looking you in the eye, paying as much attention as possible, at best, they're retaining like 30% of what it is that you're trying to communicate. So what do? You kind of have to tell the story over and over again to different audiences, different ways. You have to ask people to tell the story back to you. That's a really effective way to figure out if they actually heard what you're saying. And then once you get to the point where people get a little annoyed that you talk about this vision a lot, that's when you start to think, okay, we've communicated this vision sufficiently that people are actually beginning to turn it around and think about how it applies to their own work. There's this old story. It's in like most major religions have a version of this, lots of fables. But it's the story about the blind men and the elephant. And the story goes that there's these three blind men, and they approach an elephant, and each one of them is examining what's in front of them. And then they come back to the group with their analysis of what they saw. So the guy who stood in front of the trunk says, well, an elephant is a long tube. It moves around a lot. It can suck up water. It can pick things up. The guy who was standing in front of the leg says, oh, it was a column. It was built to support a very heavy weight. The guy who was standing next to the ear was like, oh, it was very soft, and it fluttered in the breeze, but there was no breeze. And then they get back to a group, and they just argue with each other about what it was that they saw. So in the story, then the prophet or the old man or the king or whomever shows up, and he says, oh, it was an elephant. And then it was like, oh, thank you. You really helped. But for us, we always have to think about the problem the other way around. Because you can come in and you can describe to everyone, hey, it's an elephant. And most of the time, people won't understand what it is you're talking about because they sit in front of their part of the elephant all day, and that's all they think about. So you'll have your privacy lead, and all he's going to think about when you're talking about your project is how this potential project is just going to create a leaky sieve of information that's a terrible threat to personal privacy. Or your security lead will think about how it's just a disaster from a denial of service attack perspective, or whatever it is. It's completely normal. You work in this field. This is what you think about all day. So you have to think about how to bridge that gap. You've got to think about how your vision actually could apply to the folks and then help them connect your vision to theirs so that you can realize that goal. A few companies ago, I was tasked with, this is another build a very large catalog kind of project. It was about building a listing site for land. Again, this was a while ago. This was before Zillow and Redfin. But in the United States, at least, there were a lot of market pressures that were helping push companies like Zillow or Redfin or some of the other large real estate companies to create these massive databases of searchable primary real estate. But there was no pressure to create what was a very common scenario, which is people would like to buy a plot of land somewhere. And so the idea was born, and I was hired to this company. I think I was the 12th employee. It was called LandWatch. And it already had like a few thousand listings that they were getting from various sources, but they had this great vision. that we would have searchable, browsable, natural language-enabled, map-enabled way for you to find the perfect property for yourself. And I would get up and I would dutifully explain this vision to the designers and to the engineers, and to everyone was, oh, it's fantastic, and the investors loved it. And when I would present this vision to the actual people whose job was to get the listings, they would just look at me and sort of squint and nod a little, and then just kind of go back to what they were doing. And to this team, this vision just sounded like a bunch of marketing fluff. They couldn't connect with what it was I was talking about, and I had to sit down and figure out why. Well, it turned out that for this particular type of property listing, 99% of the information that you might actually find useful was not present. There was no picture, there was no map, there was not even an address most of the time, or even really like a description of how big it was. Because these kinds of properties, they would come on the market and they sit there for a long time because nobody wants to buy like a little piece of land until someone says, oh, that's my perfect land. So realtors didn't put that information into the services, and most of the services weren't set up. They were set up for primary home real estate anyway, so they would have forms like how many bedrooms, how many baths, et cetera, but they didn't have any way for you to even input information about these land listings. So we had to take a different approach. We had to figure out what to do to get this data, and in the end, we ended up working directly with realtors and directly with people who owned property and wanted to sell it. And eventually that grew to LandWatch, which was the largest source of, and most popular source of land listings in the United States. In fact, it was recently sold to CoStar for quite a lot of money. So it never would have happened, though, if we hadn't taken the time to really understand what the underlying elephant in the room was, if you will, to really figure out how to get that vision to resonate with the individuals who are responsible for building the underlying building blocks. Now, if you're on a team that always meets their obligations, always hits the budget, never misses a deadline, there's no management, there's no drama, congratulations, you are very talented, or you're surrounded by talented people, or you're very lucky, or maybe all of those things. But for a moment, let's assume that there's something wrong with your team, or it's a new team, you're trying to form it, but you're looking at a project, you're trying to understand why it's not working. The key really is to understand the roles that are required for success, much more so than the names of the people or the titles that they have. It's not until you really sit down and think about what roles are truly needed for success will you be able to understand if a team is sensibly staffed. So for Agile development, we all love working with small teams, right? But if every project were perfectly funded, you would have a dedicated product manager, a dedicated Scrum Master, you'd have a lead designer, a development lead, a QA lead, the right number of security, privacy, regulatory folks, whatever. But that never actually happens. So you have to ask yourself, what roles are actually important to the success of this particular project? Now, I'm not familiar with a ton of projects that don't require someone or a couple of people to serve the role of Scrum Master. Somehow, the work needs to get scheduled, tickets need to get written, they gotta get prioritized, someone's gotta assign them, the trains have to run on time. And if your project is fortunate enough to have a dedicated Scrum Master and those things aren't happening, it's easy to figure out where the problem is. But most of the time, you won't have the luxury of a dedicated staff to do just that thing, but you'll still see that the Scrum Master role is being satisfied in some fashion. You'll have, the dev lead will be prioritizing the tickets, team members will be taking their own notes and making the individual components more understandable to others. It's kind of a group effort and, things move along and it works great. But as individuals, they're all contributing a piece, regardless of their title, they're contributing pieces of this role. So sometimes, though, you'll have a project not going well, and there is someone with that title. Say, for example, you've got designs, but the designs aren't helpful because you have a designer. Now, maybe it's because the designer is actually pretty terrible at their job. It could be. But it's pretty uncommon in the professional world. Usually, the designer is actually quite talented, but for some reason or another, they don't know enough about the specific goals of the project, what the user scenario is that's being addressed, what the target audience is, what the core requirements are. Whatever it is, the failure of the design is rarely because the designer is talentless. It's usually because they're being fed information that is not sufficient for them to make designs that are actually useful. But it doesn't, I'm using design as an example because that's one of the most common gaps, but you could have a gap in database design. You could have a gap in automated testing. There's just that role or that piece of knowledge that happens to be missing that's also important to the success of your project. And when those two things are out of alignment, it can be very hard to get things on track. Now, I can assure you in advance that if you go to your management team and you say, I'm sorry, this project is off the tracks, over budget, over time, but if we had a full-time designer, it would work perfectly. 95% of the time, maybe 99% of the time, you're not going to walk out of that meeting with like a commitment to hire that designer or hire that database lead. You'll go back and forth with your leaders. You'll discuss the time. You'll discuss the budget, blah, blah, blah. Things will happen. But the only thing that's for certain is the designs will continue to suck, and time will pass, and the project will either slow down or the quality will continue to drop until some breaking point occurs, and usually that, unfortunately, if it's a startup, is the failure of your company, or if it's a larger project, it's like the failure of your particular team. No one wants to be part of that. So you really have to focus on figuring out what specific gap is from a role perspective and focus on making sure that that is accomplished by yourself or by someone else or by a bunch of people in your group rather than thinking about how the title can be filled. Another example of a common gap between title and role is one of leadership. Surely on paper, almost every project has, at least sometimes two people, someone who is, in charge of the project. Insofar as that's their title maybe, or, every time the email comes out, it says, Bob's in charge or whatever. But if that person doesn't have the support of the group, they will frequently not be able to accomplish what it is that they've been asked to do. And if things go off the rails, it'll usually get way worse before it gets better. And there's a lot of reasons this could happen, but the most common reason is that there is an actual leader in the group, just someone with a natural personality of leadership, and there is some tension between that person or persons and the person who is ostensibly in charge. So you might have a situation where there's the real leader and then the named leader, and they just kind of have this quiet, snarky battle between each other, saying, oh, those plans are dumb, don't do, and nothing happens. Nobody quite figure out why, because yes, there is a leader, and no one's being over the top unprofessional. It's just creating a gap. So how can you figure out who in a group is like a natural leader? And I don't mean natural leader like Napoleon Bonaparte or something. I just mean there are people with personalities that, maybe someone says every day, hey, you guys want to go to lunch? And everyone stands up and says, sure. Okay, or maybe there's someone who, when things get stressful at the office, everyone goes and talks to that person about how stressed they are. Or maybe there's someone who, typically coordinates the happy hour after work. Those people are doing those things, not just because they enjoy going to happy hour, but because they have certain parts of their personality come out as natural leaders. And if you can build rapport between that group of people and the actual leader, you can actually get those folks to work together, get them all on the same page, establish just a little bit of camaraderie, a little bit of rapport, and you can make that disconnect between the project leader and the natural personalities get minimized, and the leaders will help push the objectives of the team right along with the leader of the team who has a real name. So at my last startup, we were tasked with essentially rebuilding from scratch a platform capable of sustaining 13 million learners who wanted to take on a new language. This wasn't a small task, and each time we would review the backlog and go through the task of describing the next piece of the puzzle that we need to put together. Inevitably, some question about scale and the fact that we would need this to immediately be able to scale, because we weren't starting something from scratch with a long ramp up. We were taking an old product and switching over to a new one. So we needed to hit that scale immediately. There was always this voice from the back of the room who would frequently pipe up with, an expression of disbelief or doubt. He might say, oh, that'll never work, but he'd sort of mumble it under his breath. And, this was nothing major. it's not like he was being disruptive or unprofessional, and these were legitimately challenging problems that we were solving, but he was a natural leader, and so his casual quips would have an outsized effect on the other members of the group. A couple of times he would be absent from sprint planning, and I sort of noticed that it was a little bit less negative. So I took him out to lunch, and I talked to him about this concern. And at the next meeting, when a concern about capacity came up, he just sort of cracked his knuckles and he said, "It's not a problem. I'm sure we can figure that out." Now, this wasn't even his problem to solve, but his confidence was just as infectious as his doubt. And so even though it wasn't his issue to solve, just him changing that tiny little behavior helped the group work together to feel more positive about solving the problems. He was a natural leader, and recognizing his role instead of focusing on his title — he wasn't the dev lead, he was just a good guy who was trying to solve problems with the rest of us — it helped us get that particular product out the door. And by the way, we did reach performance at scale the day we launched, and I don't think it would have happened if he hadn't changed his approach. So at my current company, we have adopted the scaled Agile framework. I'm very pleased with the success that we've had. It's been about 2.5 years. We've been seriously embracing this approach, and by seriously, I mean our engineering lead presents it at Atlassian conferences. Our program and product management team, we're deeply involved. If you'd like, you can go to the Atlassian website and watch videos that the team produced about how to do Agile at scale. Because bringing together our global team, at times we would have 20 concurrent sprints going on simultaneously. This was not an easy feat, because all these projects are deeply interconnected. But the toolbox that SAFe gave us has been extremely useful. We also have really gone out of our way to embrace, and I noticed one of the other speakers was talking about this, enabling technology for DevOps and just making all of the plumbing happen without too much of a hassle for everyone so they can actually focus on solving the problem in front of them. There are other competing frameworks that are quite similar. People ask me, is method X better than method Y? But in reality, there are so many reasons that it would work. It's 6 of one or half dozen the other. Your job is to just understand what it is that this piece of the framework actually, what is the point? So, we do the stand-up meetings, we do the system demos, we do the inspect and adapt workshops. Why do we do the stand-up meetings? Because it's healthy to stand up, because it's better than sitting. We meet every day because we want to see everyone else's funny t-shirts? No, we stand up because if you sit down, it's easy for a meeting to go on for too long. You stand in a circle, you talk to each other. If it goes on for longer than 15 minutes, someone is oversharing or your team is too big. There are reasons that these elements of Agile exist, and that's actually the important part. You could totally have a stand-up sitting down. It's better to stand up, but if you sit down and you remember what the point of it is, it can totally work just fine. One of the things that we have had real good success with are the inspect and adapt workshops. But you have to make sure that those aren't turning into just an airing of grievances where there's a lot of circular discussions and unfocused venting of frustrations. You actually have to buy into the idea yourself first and then everyone else that this is actually going to work, and then make sure that there's enough trust and respect between the team members to make these inspect and adapt workshops very helpful. I've been at companies where the after incident report, that's what they call it in the military, was referred to as a post-mortem, which literally means after death. These meetings, and not just because of the horrible name, were characterized by a lot of what I would like to call blame storming. There's finger pointing and anxiety and embarrassment, but there's no real change, there's no improvement. But with inspect and adapt workshops, where especially at my current company, it's not just that we have the buy-in of everyone involved. We practice this pretty regularly. I think every 4 weeks we have a huge one for the company, and then every 2 weeks we have it at the sprint level. And the outcomes, sometimes it's very tactical. We just change the way JIRA tickets flow through the system, or we make check-ins easier. And sometimes they're strategic. Some of the information that's come back has helped me or my management team change our behavior, even changing our hiring processes. These workshops, you have to be very open to the outcomes and think of them as something that is designed to be productive, and the likelihood of it being productive becomes quite high. You have to remember that it's not a contest of heroes and villains, but rather a group of people who collaborate, work together, all towards a common goal. The essence of good timing. I notice that I have 1 minute left, so I'll be quick. Don't take too long to make decisions. You also need to establish milestones. And you really have to make sure that scope, resources, and time help you stay in reality. But remember, it works both ways, right? A project never finishes before it was supposed to, almost never costs less than it was supposed to, and almost never has more features than everyone thought that it was going to. So as you're going through those negotiations, remember that each point of the triangle may be the one that needs to be looked at, and that point of the triangle might be the one that you care the most about. But once you start thinking about agility as like a state of being and a state of working, and not just remembering to go in and adhere to the frameworks perfectly, you'll find that you can flex and change in the right ways for your business. At the beginning of this chat, I asked everybody exactly what it was you were trying to make more agile, and I hope that you can apply these questions about why a project exists or what it was you were trying to achieve, etc., to make things a lot better and a lot more productive for yourselves. Success is always a team effort, and anyone who tells you that it's about one person or using a single tool, they probably have an agenda, or maybe they're trying to sell you something. So you've got this. You guys are all great, and thank you so much for having me.